So I want to start with that last piece of evidence entered into the record today by the 1-6 Select Committee, Neil. Everything they said there was described by Bill Barr as, quote, crazy stuff, quote, bullshit, and a sign of Trump losing contact with reality. I mean, you really saw the whole life cycle of Trump's knowingly peddling lies to his supporters and the violent criminal acts they carried out in service of those lies.
Exactly, Nicole. So, and a lot of this is stuff we've heard before, that Donald Trump was deluded from reality, that he believed BS, to use Bill Barr's technical term, the people around him were second rate and not team normal. We've heard all that before. That's the what question. But this is the who question. To hear it today, not from Democrats, but Republicans, and not just from Republicans, but Trump's people, and not just from Trump's people, but Trump's inner circle. That's what's so amazing about the testimony today. I mean, Trump is running out of people to attack. I mean, Bill Barr's now, he's attacking as disloyal and weak and stuff. These were Trump's key stalwarts. And, you know, I know that there's a whole kind of line of thinking, nobody's watching these hearings, it's not going to change anyone's view or something. But something like this, where you have crossovers from the serious, most inner circle of Trump, may really do something. I'm reminded of, you know, our prosecution in the George Floyd case. You know, it's very hard to prosecute a cop for murder. Almost never happens. But we did have in that case people like Chief Arredondo cross over and say, you know, the chief of police saying this was wrong. And a jury convicted 22.5 years for the defendant in that case. And again, here, it may not matter with Trump's base, this testimony today and what we heard, but there's a larger audience and there's potentially a jury, just as there was in the Floyd case.
Well, Neil, 20 million people actually watched on Thursday night. I don't think there are any ratings from this morning's hearing, but we know that perhaps the most important person is watching. Merrick Garland said from the podium of the Justice Department today he's watching. And I want to ask you about the irrefutable body of evidence now in the public record from this committee that Donald Trump knowingly lied. I think there was a little bit of, oh, he's so crazy. And that was always, I think Don Jr. relied on that in the Mueller probe, the incompetence defense. We didn't know he was talking to the Russians and they didn't know they had the. I mean, what is the impact of this irrefutable body of evidence that all of the crazy stuff was actually investigated, and we skip over that at our own peril? I thought some of the blockbuster evidence was that U.S. attorneys and the Justice Department and the Attorney General investigated all of this, and I'll use Bill Barr's technical term, BS, and found nothing. Let me play some of that testimony. This is testimony from Richard Donahue's deposition and some live testimony from former U.S. Attorney Pack.
The president kept fixating on this suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots, and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility.
Mr. Giuliani only played a clip that showed them pulling out the official ballot box from under the table, and referring to that as a smoking gun of a fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because of the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box back out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
So, Neil, I mean, I thought, and I said no, sir, was in some ways the most damning testimony for Trump. He investigates this plot and then goes and reports back to Trump. And I said no, sir, that's not the case. And same with Mr. Pack. He reveals here that the FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos and purportedly were double, triple counting the ballots and determined that, no, nothing irregular happened. The allegations made by Giuliani were false.
I think it's impossible, Nicole, for Merrick Garland to ignore that evidence today that you're pointing to, because legally, the key to Trump's defense has always been, look, I genuinely believed I won the election. And that's why the testimony today is so significant. What those clips you're playing, these aren't Dems or something saying this. These are Trump's inner circle, people that Trump appointed to high positions at the Justice Department, all saying that that is poppycock. And short of Donald Trump standing up and finding evidence saying that he said, "I never believe I won," or something like that, this testimony is about as good as it gets. I don't think any jury would agree that Donald Trump could have plausibly ignored the entire Justice Department as well as all of his advisors and accepted in good faith, by contrast, the testimony, the words of an inebriated Rudy Giuliani. I mean, that beggars belief. And Trump didn't have a genuine belief he won and defended against all challenges. What today's testimony showed is he brought rumor after rumor to these officials at the Justice Department in the hopes that one of them would stick. And if a jury managed to conclude that he genuinely believed all of them the second that he heard these kind of poppycock stories, it could only be because his lawyers in a criminal trial one day ran one heck of an insanity defense, because no rational person could believe this in the face of all of the investigations the department did to track down all of his cockamamie theories.
You know, and Joyce, Ben Ginsburg's testimony also points to the fact that anything happening after Election Day that would have changed the outcome was impossible. It was never going to happen. And between the Ginsburg testimony and the former Fox official testifying to the fact that there was never any doubt in his mind that Trump had lost once the election was called, they never looked back. These calls weren't even close. That seemed to also be bricks in that wall that Trump knew he'd lost and knew nothing would change that outcome. Let me play some of Ben Ginsburg's testimony for you.
Trump campaign had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close. In 2000, that was 537 and close. In this election, the most narrow margin was 10,000 and something in Arizona, and you just don't make up those sorts of numbers in recounts. And when the claims of fraud and irregularities were made, you've heard very compelling testimony from Mr. Stepien, from Matt Morgan, from Alex Cannon about those claims and how they didn't believe them. And so that put the Trump campaign on sort of a process of bringing cases without the actual evidence that you have to have in which the process is designed to bring out.
So, Joyce, for any of our viewers that don't know, I mean, Ben Ginsburg is a longtime trusted hand to Republican candidates for president, and he was a lawyer on the Bush v. Gore case and the Bush recount. He's talking about 537 votes in Florida. That's one state. Trump was looking at making up tens of thousands of votes in 6 states.
Ben Ginsburg is sort of a Democratic version of Mark Elias for voters who aren't familiar, or for listeners who aren't familiar with him, someone who's steeped in election law. And so when he says this, it's really important. He makes the point that Trump had to win not just in one state, but in 3 states. At a minimum, he would have had to have had recounts, and that wasn't happening. So if you're Merrick Garland, how does this strike you? What you're listening for is, what did people actually communicate directly to Trump? Because if Merrick Garland isn't going to have direct evidence that Trump knew he had lost the election, the theory he has to have is one of willful blindness, that Trump stuck his head in the sand. And so when you have witness after witness come in and say, on the night of the election, Trump declared his victory despite being told by people in the campaign that he didn't have the numbers, ultimately you have to get precise testimony from those witnesses of what they said to Trump. You want to get some of his reaction in too, if you can. And then when you get into the hardcore examples of voter fraud that Trump kept throwing up and saying this is fraud, and people at DOJ repeatedly striking that down, Bill Barr, Rich Donahue, and you hear BJ Pak saying, we investigated because Bill Barr told us it was a top priority. So we went out and found that the president's case of fraud in Georgia wasn't a case of fraud after all, and that's communicated back to Trump. That evidence all accumulates into a very solid block of proof of willful blindness.